Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our fourth storyteller of the evening, Marsha Music.
Thank you very much. I was a daddy's girl, and I love my daddy. My daddy was a big man on Hastings Street, where the Chrysler Freeway is now. And my daddy would take me to work with him. We would drive down John R. We would go past the horse stables for the police horses. And we would stop and he would let me look at the horses. Or we would drive down Woodward Avenue and we would pass the Thinker, the Rodin statue in front of the Detroit Institute of Arts. And every time we would go by, like a ritual, he would say, "That's you. You're the thinker." And I always sat way up high in that shotgun seat of his Buick. So proud that my daddy called me a thinker. My daddy called me Ling Ting Tong. That was an old record, a very popular record back in those days. My daddy used to take us to Belle Isle and we would scream and holler when he would drive up underneath the tunnel, underneath Jefferson Avenue. "Blow the horn, Daddy, blow the horn." And we would barbecue and he would fly giant kites on Belle Isle and let us hold the string and hope that it didn't carry us away into the sky. I love my daddy. My daddy was a big man on Hastings Street. He owned a record shop called Joe's Record Shop. And he was the record man for the blues in this city. All the people that were coming up from the South that still liked their blues. He recorded and he sold records. And so he recorded records by people like John Lee Hooker and Little Sonny and Washboard Willie, because he played, guess what? The washboard. And he recorded people that just walked in off the street, because in those days our culture was so vibrant and people literally walked down the streets playing instruments and singing in the streets. And he would walk in and record this humanity that was going on at that time. They called my daddy the mighty Jovan Battle. He was a big man on Hastings Street. He recorded the Reverend C.L. Franklin. And he recorded each and every one of his over 75 sermons and records that played on the radio on Sunday night. It was a ritual in Detroit to listen to C.L. Franklin at night. He also recorded his daughter Aretha, her very first records when she was 13, 14 years old, when she was still a gospel singer with the choir. My daddy was a big man. My daddy let me read a story that I had written when I was a little girl. In elementary school, I wrote a poem called "I Love Michigan." And my daddy let me read it on his radio show. I love my daddy. In 1960, when I was about 6 years old, we got the news that the Hastings Street record shop was going to have to close because Chrysler Freeway was coming through. It was going to take everything in its path. And my daddy's record shop was right there. It's time to go. But before that, I got to tell you about my mama. My mother was a pretty woman. Now, when I tell you that my mother was a pretty woman, she was a light-skinned woman in the days when that really mattered a lot. She had red hair. They say she had a figure like a Coca-Cola bottle. That's what they used to say back in the day. My mother was beautiful. And she was so pretty that if you told her that she was pretty like Lena Horne, she would give you a look. She'd smile at you, but she'd give you a look like, you better come up higher than that. Because she knew how pretty she was. And she ain't never lied. She was just that pretty. She was so pretty, I'd be scared to walk down the street with her. I was scared somebody was going to take her. And I'd have to run back home and tell my daddy, somebody got mama. She was a pretty woman. She came from She was one of 5 sisters, sanctified sisters, from the sanctified church that was up on Mack Avenue. To this day, we call it Mack Avenue. And it was headed by the great-grandfather of the Winans today, Zion Congregational Church of God in Christ. It's a church she grew up in. And it was down the street from the record shop on Hastings Street. And so one day they were coming home from the record shop, and my mama stopped for the bus to get home from church. And my daddy saw her. And he looked at her and he thought she could sell a whole lot of records. And as it turned out, she could, because she was a pretty woman and an appealing woman. And she had the type of spirit that people liked to be around her, because she had a kind of gentle languidness about her. She was not a haughty, beautiful woman. And she sold a lot of records, and she was extremely musical. But she hated them old country blues of my daddy. She couldn't stand that music. She liked modern music. She liked Johnny Mathis and Nat King Cole, and later on, she liked Motown. So I grew up with my mom and daddy. My daddy rich, and my mama good looking. And I grew up in the rays of that, and the rays of those 5 beautiful sisters of theirs. Had a beautiful life. And then, after Hastings Street was gone, my daddy had to move to 12th Street. And my mom and dad used to have a lot of parties in the back of the record shop. They loved to party. And they would have people from all over. When you came to Detroit and you was in the music and the blues, you went to Joe's record shop. And if you was cool, you would have a taste in the back of the record shop at night. You know, have a taste. And so they had a lot of parties, a lot of good times. And my mother loved the 20 grand. You go see Marvin Gaye, Chuck Jackson, have a good time. But on 12th Street, when the record shop moved from Hastings to 12th Street, things had changed. People didn't listen to the old blues like they used to. Things were very different over there. And my daddy changed. He was despondent on the loss of his business. And it was very difficult to pull that business back together in quite the same big way as it was. And those tastes that he was having in the backyard, in the back of the record shop, they started turning into something else. It was not just a taste, but it was turning into alcoholism. And so in those years after 1960, my life changed. Now, I remember my daddy, when we walked up into our new house, my daddy had bought my mother a house in Highland Park. He just bought her a house, a big, giant house in Highland Park. You know how those houses are in Highland Park. Some of them are very beautiful and big. And he bought her a house, sight unseen. She had never seen it. And my mother, I was a baby girl. I'm going back to when I was about 3 years old. My mother was furious. She was just furious. I knew it. Now, I don't know if she was mad because this big, giant house, she was going to have to clean and all that. And I'm going to tell you, housework was not my mother's strong suit. Okay? That's not what she did. And I didn't know if it was that, or maybe it was that it was a house rather than a wedding ring, because they were not married. And in fact, my father's wife was real upset about that house. Okay? Now, I did not know that they were not married. And they were not to marry until another 2.5 kids came, because my father's wife did not want to give my father a divorce to marry this woman. So I was the oldest outside child of my daddy. And I was very blessed in that my elder sisters and brothers, my daddy's kids, loved my mother. And they loved us, children. They loved the kids that my mother had. So they doted on us. So that was a real blessing to grow up in a situation like that, because it could have been real ugly, although I'm going to tell you, their mama never was feeling me. I'm going to tell you. And I never knew why. And I never knew that backstory until 8 years ago when my mother passed away. And finally, people began to tell me the truth of what had really happened. Because in those days, there was a great deal of shame about things like that, particularly about girls who were supposed to be church girls. So the record shop was on 12th Street now, and my dad is getting worse. And our life went from being an idyllic dream in Highland Park to a nightmare. We began to live in the chaos and confusion and terror of advanced alcoholism. And my mother and father were at war. And us kids, we were the casualties of war. We were the innocent bystanders that were in the middle of this pitched battle between the parents. And it's kind of ironic because our family name is Battle. My father's name was Jovan Battle, and he was known as the mighty Jovan Battle. It got worse. The fight was so bad we were afraid to sleep at night, afraid that one of them wouldn't live over the night, which one would kill the other one. I'm very grateful that my father wasn't cut out the type of cloth. He wasn't any sexual thing or anything like that, abuse like that. And in fact, my father rarely, if ever, put his hands on me. He would just clown, rage. Sometimes he would just get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and be vacuuming downstairs, waking up everybody in the house. Vacuuming, because he's trying to send a message. Something wrong with y'all in this housekeeping, because I told you about my mother with her beautiful self. So time went on, it got worse. Their battles were so great that we got to the point we were afraid at night, terrified. And then they would get into big battles with each other. And one day, my mother was coming home, and my father cracked her in the head when she walked in the door, cracked her in the head with a bat. And the blood ran down her pretty face. And then sometime later, in retaliation from some other thing that they were into, my mother, in a fit of chaos, boiled water and poured it all over my father while he ate breakfast in the kitchen. And I watched the skin fall off of his back in sheets, in third-degree burns. And then once it happened, she was so undone about what she had done, she couldn't face it, and I had to attend to his wounds every day before I went to school. After a while, school became too much for me. And I wanted to hang out with the fast girls, because I wanted to be fast, but I really wasn't fast. I was really a nerd. But I wanted to be with the fast girls. But what happened is that, you know how people run away to join the circus? You heard that? They ran away and joined the circus. I ran away to join the movement, the black movement, the revolutionary movement, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And I hooked up with these older gentlemen, but I'm going to tell you, they saved my life. They took me under their wing. They had an office in Highland Park, and they took me out of a future that would have been with the fast girls, getting on drugs and all this kind of thing, and they sat me down and said, study. And I began to read and study and learn about the world and learn about black people. They saved my life. A gentleman named General Baker was one of the people who saved my life. As time went on, my dad grew increasingly worse. And even though they tried to put their arms around me and keep me out of harm's way, I did end up getting pregnant. And I ended up hooking up with somebody that was crazier than my daddy at the time. He's actually doing very well right now. He's a good guy now. But he was going through his thing. And I ended up dropping out of school. I dropped out of school and when I almost finished. But I couldn't go anymore because the stress and the difficulty in the home was just so great. And I felt like I left home to be with this guy, and I felt like I had abandoned my younger siblings, to leave them there in all of that chaos and confusion. Because in 1967, 12th Street was destroyed, and my father's record shop was destroyed with it. And it was a real blow to him. It was the end of his way of life. It was the end of his life. And he began to drink increasingly worse. And I can remember he was having a cup of coffee on the picnic table in the backyard. Quiet, beautiful day, birds singing. And I looked out the window, and it was a white truck drove up. And men jumped out the truck, and they had a straitjacket, and they strapped my father down with his hands behind his back, and he hollered out, "Help me, help me." And all I could do was just stand there. I could not help him because I was a co-conspirator. Because his raging would be so great, my mother would have him committed. And then by the time they would get there, he sobered up. And so he just quiet, just minding his own business, and now he's in a straitjacket. And he would take him to a place called Eloise. Too many of y'all said yeah about that now. I don't know. Okay, a little history, what we say, a little black history. So finally, my father ended up drinking himself to death, along with the fact that he had an affliction called Addison's disease, which was an affliction of the adrenals. And he drank himself to death. And it was a relief when he died. There was no grief. I had no grief when he died. It was a relief. My whole family was set free. It was horrible. And I spent the next years just trying to put the pieces of my head back together. And my mother had roused herself out of her ennui and went and got a job to support the rest of the children and put my sister and brother through school. After all of those years of getting her hair done and doing her nails, going to the 20 grand. So it's just an amazing thing that happened in the family. But I was full of post-traumatic bitterness and hatred toward my father. And the father that I had known was long gone. Until one day, and things were happening, a man named the famous Coachman, who was a blues man in Detroit, a disc jockey. I saw him in the grocery store one day, and he said, "You ought to write a book about your daddy." I was being polite. Okay, yeah, okay, whatever. And then Frantic Ernie Durham, another DJ who I saw, he said to me, "You ought to write a book about your daddy. He was a great man." Whatever. But I always remembered that. And then over the years, what happened was the internet allowed me to start writing a few stories. I began to write stories on the internet. And I would tell stories about growing up in the record shop and about my dad. And much to my shock, there were people all over the world who knew the name of my father. Record collectors and music people and the connoisseurs of music, they knew all about Joe Von Battle and regarded him as a pillar of the Detroit sound. And so in these years, I have begun writing about my father. I was awarded a Kresge Fellowship in the Literary Arts for some of my work. And I have been putting his legacy back together again. And then I realized that I had forgiven my father. Now, my older sisters and brothers, my half-sisters and brother, his children, they're very happy about this work that I'm doing, resurrecting the old Joe Battle that they knew. My younger siblings, not so much. They're not so happy because they don't know the Joe Von Battle that they knew. All they knew was a raging, insane man. And so what I just want to finish by saying is that in trying to find the old Joe, I found my love again for my father. And I'm a bridge, perhaps, between the older kids and the younger ones. And I am so grateful for every moment that I have been given to look into his extraordinary legacy. And in fact, I'm working on not only a book, but a documentary film about his life with co-producer Juanita Anderson here in Detroit. And so I can honestly say, in that war that I lived through, I have survived, and I'm a daddy's girl, and I am still, once again, in love with my daddy. Thank you.
Marsha Music.